So we have seen much of Jesus' ministry up till this point. We saw the beginning when John the Baptist, who was a type of Elijah, baptizing Jesus in water. Then we had Jesus going to various places, starting in the small towns, those off in the distance, healing the sick. He would heal all manner of things. He would give sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf and dumb, and the ability to speak. Those that were crippled and unable to walk or had other physical abnormalities, he restored them as well, all manner of healing. And he would cast out demons, evil spirits that would possess people, and they would cause harm to the possessed and to the possessed family and friends, oftentimes for long periods of time. He also went into the different synagogues and taught. He also taught outside of the synagogues. There'd be different locations that he would go to and people would gather around. As he continued on his journey, more and more people sought him out. So there were times where he would teach to thousands and they would have no food. So he would perform miracles. He would take meager amounts of food and use them to feed great multitudes and feed them till they're full. All manner of miracles did he perform. But along the way, the religious leaders, the experts, those in power feared him and did not like what he was doing. They feared that perhaps he would lead a rebellion or an uprising. And due to the political climate at the time, Rome being an occupying force of the Israelites, making them into a vassal state, they did not want to anger the Romans and have the Romans come in and put them to the sword. So they feared Jesus. And when Jesus went into the temples and tried to correct the people in there, the money changers, those exploiting the poor to lace their own pockets, chaos erupted, and they knew they had to do something about him. So the religious leaders, they bribed one of Jesus' disciples and found his location and arrested him and brought him in for trial. Now during the trial, they were not able to find a charge against him. They brought in witnesses. The witnesses weren't consistent. They didn't have a coherent story, so they were unable to charge him based on the witnesses. So they asked him directly if he was the Messiah, and he admitted that he was. And he said the words, "I am," which they were able to interpret its meaning of. There was a little bit more to this. Watch the previous video of him admitting that he was the Son of God. And because of this, they charged him and they decided to seek the death penalty for him. Now, all of this is going on during the greatest religious celebration at the time. And due to the climate with the Roman occupation, they were not able to pass out the death penalty. So in this chapter, we're going to see the Israelites, the religious leaders, take Jesus to the Roman leader to have him kill him. The Gospel of Mark 15:1. And immediately when it was morning, the chief priest and the elders and scribes and the whole council held a consultation. And when they had bound Jesus, they took him away violently and handed him over to Pilate. So the way that days are set up in the Bible are quite a bit different than the way we do it today. For instance, Friday night would be considered the beginning of the day, and then Saturday night would be the conclusion of that day. So they start at sundown and they end at sundown. And what we saw in the previous episode was sundown. Then we had the Passover feast. Then they went back to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus prayed. And then the priest men came and arrested Jesus. So they've held him all night. So during that night, or really early in the morning, that's when they charged Jesus with these crimes, and then they had all the witnesses and everything before they passed their judgment. So now it's a little bit later and it's the morning, and I guess the Romans, they're probably only open so many hours of the day, so they're bringing Jesus to Pilate, the Roman leader, to have him enact the death penalty on him. The Gospel according to Mark 15:2. And Pilate inquired of him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he replied, "It is as you say." So I don't think Pilate would have been in the best mood when the religious leaders brought Jesus to him to be executed. Rome, as the occupying force, put Pilate in charge. He is the representative of Rome. And during the festivals here and the celebrations, there were hundreds of thousands of people extra. So tensions would have been very high. And he just wants to maintain the peace. He doesn't want a riot or an uprising or anything of that level of excitement to occur. He just wants to get through this. And here's this man, this Jesus of Nazareth, being brought to him so that he can have him killed. I imagine this ruined his day. And from the beginning of the day as well, first thing in the morning, they're bringing him to him. So he begins to ask Jesus and communicate to him about this business of being the King of the Jews, something that we see Jesus confirm here. The Gospel according to Mark 15:3. And the chief priests kept accusing him of many things. 15:4. And Pilate asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they are bringing against you?" So the chief priests, they're handing Jesus over to Pilate. And as they're handing him over, they're telling Pilate of all these charges. And of course, Jesus is there and he has the opportunity. He could say, "Nope, I didn't do that," or "That's not right." Instead, he remains silent as they are charging him with all these different things. And Pilate sees this and he wonders what's going on, that Jesus is not resisting them. He is not counteracting these charges. And he's very perplexed to see that he is not defending himself. This is a very, very strange event. This is something that would not normally happen. Normally, a person would defend themselves, or they would lie to try to protect themselves from the charges. So this is something that is very noteworthy as we see here, and we'll see Pilate's response to this. The Gospel according to Mark 15:5. But Jesus made no further answer at all. So Pilate wondered and marveled. So Jesus' response here is quite unique, and it is also the fulfillment of a prophecy that we see in Isaiah. I'm going to read Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So Pilate, seeing this, was really marveled by this event. Seeing someone not even defend themselves when facing the death penalty. That is truly strange, and he didn't really know what to make of it. The Gospel according to Mark 15:6. Now at the feast he was accustomed to set free for them any one prisoner whom they requested. 15:7. And among the rioters in the prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man named Barabbas. So the Jewish historian Josephus says that Pilate was the governor of Judea for 10 years, from 26 AD to 36 AD. So during this time period, he is in a little more than the middle of his reign. And he had this custom where every year during the Passover, he would release a prisoner to the people. He wasn't a Jew and he didn't really participate in the festivities, but this was kind of his way of doing something for them during this time. So we see this man here who is in prison. His name is Barabbas. So Barabbas, he was attempting an insurrection. He was trying to overthrow the Romans, a very high-level crime. So, of course, he is going to be sentenced to death. He is going to receive the death penalty for what he was doing. But the reason why it's brought up here is because of this tradition, the releasing of the prisoner. Now, Barabbas is a very interesting name. It's made up of two parts. There's the Bar, which means son, and then we have Abba, which means father. There's some additional sounds added to it for Barabbas, but in essence, it means son of the father. So we have this man here, the son of the father, being sentenced to death. The Gospel according to Mark 15:8. And the throng came up and began asking Pilate to do as he usually did for them. 15:9. And he replied to them, "Do you wish me to set free for you the King of the Jews?" 15:10. For he was aware that it was because they were prompted by envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. 15:11. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to get him to release for them Barabbas instead. Pilate is quite reluctant. He doesn't want to send Jesus to death, and so he is trying to come up with an alternative to release him under the tradition of releasing a prisoner. He knows that the religious leaders are jealous of him, and that's why they seek his removal. Pilate is suggesting releasing the King of the Jews, but the chief priests, they get the crowd going, they get them all riled up and suggest Barabbas instead. So as a result of all of this, Barabbas, who was originally sentenced to die and was going to be crucified, gets released, and Jesus takes his place. Jesus pays the price so Barabbas does not have to. There's a lot of symbology in here with how this is playing out, how the Son of the Father gets pardoned from the death penalty by the Son of God, taking his place and paying the price in his stead. The Gospel according to Mark. 15:12. And again Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man whom you call the King of the Jews?" 15:13. And they shouted back again, "Crucify him!" 15:14. But Pilate said to them, "Why? What has he done that is evil?" But they shouted with all their might, all the more, "Crucify him at once!" So Pilate's trying to find a reason to get Jesus off, and he was going to see about doing this prisoner release program, and the people didn't really go for it. Now, the people that are here, the crowd, I would assume that they are not the people that Jesus met and healed and taught. They're probably a group of people that the priest brought. Maybe it was the same people that testified against him. Maybe they've been paid off. So there's this mob there, and they are demanding the crucifixion of Jesus. They want him dead. Pilate doesn't really understand what's going on. He doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to participate in this. But that is what the mob wants. And he is going to be obedient to the mob. He doesn't want to have a riot. He doesn't want this event here to escalate to the next level. So he is going to do what the mob desires. The Gospel according to Mark. 15:15. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, set Barabbas free for them. And after having Jesus whipped, he handed him over to be crucified. In the Gospel of John, when we read of Pilate and his interaction with Jesus, we really see the struggles that he goes through and how he does not desire Jesus to be killed and all the different ways he tries to prevent that from happening. But here in the Gospel of Mark, we don't see that as much. We saw him try to exchange Jesus for Barabbas so that Jesus could be released. But here in the Gospel of Mark, we see a more brutal side of Pilate in that he goes with the crowd and then he has Jesus scourged. We see whipped here in the Amplified translation. So they abuse him physically to an extreme degree. Now, the scourging could often kill people. They would be whipped so much that they would die from blood loss or shock. They were not whips of leather, but leather with or cord with chunks of metal or bone tied to the end. So they would actually tear off pieces of flesh. A very extreme level of abuse. In the Gospel of John, we see him trying to do this as a way of gaining sympathy. That it's like, well, look how mangled he is. Do we really have to kill him? But the crowd, they keep going and they really desire his death. But in the Gospel of Mark here, we don't see that so much. We see him pass judgment, then have him scourged and whipped, and then sent to be crucified. There's a verse in Isaiah that's very reflective of this moment. Isaiah 53:5. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Let's continue on. The Gospel according to Mark. 15:16. Then the soldiers led him away to the courtyard inside the palace, that is, the praetorium, and they called the entire detachment of soldiers together. So we have Jesus being escorted by the soldiers now, and they lead him to the praetorium. Now the praetorium is the place where the praetor is, which is the Roman magistrate or the leader. So perhaps it's a tent or some type of more permanent structure, but it is a military building or an encampment. And we see here as well that there's an entire detachment. So they're bringing all the boys out for this one. They're bringing all the soldiers. Jesus was very famous and quite infamous for what he has been doing. And as such, they are on high alert, and they have lots of military personnel there with him, securing the location and securing him before his execution. The Gospel according to Mark. 15:17. And they dressed him in a purple robe, and weaving together a crown of thorns, they placed it on him. The life of a soldier is one of two extremes. First, there is a very short amount of time where everything is crazy, super exciting, it's life or death, and battle has commenced. And then the rest of the time, everything is usually boring and very routine. And as such, they are starved for entertainment. So anytime they can do something to be entertained, they will. And here they take charge of Jesus, who they hear is the King of the Jews. So what do? They dress him up in a purple robe. Purple because it is the color of royalty. And they gave him a crown, not of gold, not of gems or silver, but one of thorns. Now, the interesting thing with the crown of thorns is that it almost relates or is symbolic of what we saw in early Genesis when it came to the curse that was placed on man after leaving the Garden of Eden, after betraying the Lord and not being obedient to the rules. I'm just going to read a quick verse, a couple verses from Genesis. Genesis 3:17. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. 3:18. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. So part of the curse is the thorns, and they made a crown of thorns for Jesus to wear. Jesus, of course, is bearing the sin of humanity, and here he is wearing an aspect of the curse that was dispensed to mankind. It's probably not a coincidence. I think it's symbolic. Now, I'm sure the Roman guards weren't thinking of any of this when they were doing this. They thought it would be funny, quite quaint, and maybe they had a laugh. The Gospel according to Mark 15:18. And they began to salute him. Hail, greetings, good health to you. Long life to you, King of the Jews. 15:19. And they struck his head with a staff made of a bamboo-like reed, and spat on him, and kept bowing their knees in homage to him. So the Romans, they're having a lot of sport with Jesus. They dress him up, and they are mocking him. And at the same time, they are beating him and hurting him, trying to find any way they can to break him. Now, the book of Isaiah foretold of this event in Isaiah 50:6. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. It's commonly believed that Jesus had his beard ripped off his face as part of the torture that he faced at the hands of the Romans, and they beat him very severely. The scourging that he received previously was immense, and we are going to see the ramifications of that severe beating and how weakened it made him very shortly. The Gospel according to Mark 15:20. And when they had finished making sport of him, they took the purple robe off of him and put his clothes on him, and they led him out of the city to crucify him. So the Romans are done having their fun with him, at least at this point in time. So they take off the purple robe. They weren't going to crucify him in the purple robe because purple is very expensive. At least the dye to make things purple is very expensive, and they didn't want it to be completely saturated in bodily fluids. So they removed that from him, they put his own clothing back on him, and they began the journey to the hill, to Calvary, for the crucifixion. The Gospel according to Mark 15:21. And they forced a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was coming in from the field country to carry his cross. 15:22. And they led him to Golgotha, in Latin, Calvary, meaning the place of a skull. So the standard issuance was that the condemned would carry their own cross. So they would have the cross there and they would carry it to the place where the crucifixion would take place. Jesus was severely beaten, probably first by the Jews, then the Romans, and then the Romans again. So he was probably in a severely weakened state. On top of he's been up all night and it's just been a rough situation. So this man who was passing by, Simon, the Romans pointed at him. They said, "Hey, you, come here." And they forced him to carry the cross as they went on this journey down to Golgotha. Now, Simon was just going about his business. He was working in the field, and maybe he was going back home for some lunch or some water or whatever the circumstance. I guess with the time of day, probably breakfast, because it was still fairly early in the morning. May have been. But now he was conscripted to carry this cross for this man, for his execution. A very strange event and a very unique day for him. But perhaps the outcome of this was the best thing to ever happen to him. We see his two children mentioned here, Alexander and Rufus. Now we see Rufus mentioned again in Romans, so there's probably a reason why they are mentioned here, that the contemporaries reading the gospel at the time of its writing would have known of them. It would be a way of anchoring this person here. The Gospel according to Mark 15:23. And they attempted to give him wine mingled with myrrh, but he would not take it. So the Romans, they weren't going to just string him up on the cross. They were going to give him a chance for a final meal, or in this instance, a final beverage. Jesus, of course, refused them. He was not going to drink wine. He said that he was not going to drink wine until he was in heaven at the appointed time. He made this declaration previously during the Last Supper, that this was going to be the last time he would drink wine until then. So he refused the drink, and they proceeded with the crucifixion. The Gospel according to Mark 15:24. And they crucified him, and they divided his garments, and distributed them among themselves, throwing lots for them to decide who should take what. So they have now stripped Jesus naked, and they have nailed him to the cross. And the cross was raised up. Nails in each of his hands outstretched apart, and nails in the feet. The method of death imposed by crucifixion is suffocation. The way that suffocation occurs is related to the weight of the body in conjunction with the outstretched arms. The body, the torso, is not connected to the cross. So So all the weight of the body is on the arms. The legs in crucifixion are not straight up and down, they are bent on an angle so that the victim needs to straighten their legs. And what happens, the body leans forward, and as the body leans forward, it applies pressure and makes it very difficult to breathe. So in order to breathe, one must hold themselves up straight with their legs and their arms. And as time passes, the joints weaken and muscular strength deteriorates, and the person's body begins to slump. And as it slumps, it becomes more and more difficult to breathe until suffocation occurs. Now, this would be a lethal form of execution even if it did not have the nails and they were simply tied to the cross. But the nails are a method to make it even more painful, because then the victim needs to pull or push against these piercings to maintain the position to breathe properly. Crucifixion is an incredibly brutal form of execution. So after the Roman guards stripped Jesus naked and crucified him, they distributed his possessions amongst themselves, and then they came to his nice coat, and it would be a shame to cut it apart to divide it, so instead they gambled on it and played a game of lots to see who would take possession of it. And we see this idea here prophesied in Psalms 22:18. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. The Gospel according to Mark 15:25. And it was the 3rd hour, about 9 o'clock in the morning, when they crucified him. So the Romans were very quick with this. Jesus was brought to them very early in the morning, and they already had a cross prepared because they were going to execute Barabbas. And Jesus took his spot, he took his position. So everything went very smoothly, and here we are, 9 o'clock in the morning, and he is on the cross. This sounds very similar to what we see in Psalms 22. I'm going to read starting at verse 14. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it has melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death, for the dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far from me. O my strength, hasten to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dogs. Save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. And that was up to verse 21. The whole psalm is pretty incredible to read, but it seems very similar to this circumstance. The Gospel according to Mark 15:26. And the inscription of the accusation against him was written above, the King of the Jews. 15:27. And with him they crucified 2 robbers, one his right hand and one his left. So the Gospel of Mark is a very streamlined gospel, and it doesn't have a lot of the additional details that we see in the other Gospels. It's very to the point. Here we have the inscription, the words that they wrote above Jesus, and that would have been attached to the cross as well above, saying that he was the King of the Jews. Now in the other Gospels we see a little bit of conflict between Pilate and the religious leaders. They want him to change it. They don't want it to say that. For obvious reasons, they don't want him to be declared the King of the Jews. And they want him to rephrase it to say that he said he was the King of the Jews. But we don't see that here in the Gospel of Mark. And when it comes to the robbers beside him, in the other Gospels, we get to learn more about them. Especially the Gospel of John. It's got a lot of additional details, but we're just going to keep going with what we have here and not focus so much on what the other Gospels say and focus more on what this Gospel says. The Gospel according to Mark 15:28. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, he was counted among the transgressors. So the scriptures are fulfilled. Well, why don't we go take a look at that scripture? And it's in Isaiah 53, verse 12. Therefore I will divide and give him a portion with the great kings and rulers, and he shall divide the spoils with the mighty, because he willingly poured out his life to death, and was counted among the transgressors. Yet he himself bore and took away the sin of many, and interceded with the Father for the transgressors. What an incredible verse. That just says it all right there. That is the role, and that is what is done, or was done. Absolutely incredible. Let's continue on. I think the scripture says what it needs to right there. The Gospel according to Mark 15:29. And those who passed by kept reviling him and reproaching him abusively in harsh and insolent language, wagging their heads and saying, Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. So this is a public execution meant to be as shameful as possible. So this is not some place out in the middle of nowhere, but somewhere where people go by and they're making fun of him, they're mocking him. Perhaps they have seen the sign above that he's the King of the Jews, and they find this quite comical, that here's this man who claims to be the Son of God, the King of the Jews, and here he is hanging on the cross. We see mention here of the prophecy that he gave about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. Of course, they did not know that the temple that he was talking about was his body. They thought it was the physical temple, the temple of Herod. Now, the temple of Herod was quite big and grand, and some of the stones that made it up would probably take more than 3 days to get in position or to even carve out of the stone. So that is why they are making a mockery of this. It's kind of a common trend for people to mock things they don't know or they don't really understand. Or they receive their theology from comedians, which is not necessarily the best place to get that from. So people were mocking Jesus then, and they mock him now, often for the exact same reasons then as today. They don't really know, they don't really understand. They see the commentary around it and they join in and participate. The Gospel according to Mark 15:30. Now rescue yourself from death, coming down from the cross. So they continue to mock him, and they are looking for a sign that if he is the Son of God, that he can simply step down. Now, this is something that he could do. He could just abandon his role, step down, and the rest of humanity would be screwed. And that was probably a temptation made against him. That was Satan speaking there. Step down, let this suffering end. But Jesus wasn't going to do that. He stayed up there by choice because he was the Son of God. He did not fall into temptation. He was better than that. The Gospel according to Mark 15:31. So also the chief priests with the scribes made sport of him to one another, saying, He rescued others from death. Himself he is unable to rescue. So the chief priests here, they don't realize that they are in essence quoting scripture, or the scripture makes reference of this event ahead of time. So I guess it's a type of prophecy. But in Psalms 22, starting at 7, all those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, He trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. In the other Gospels, we receive more information about the priest and just how peculiar this situation is, and how much Scripture is fulfilled by their conversation one to another. It's really quite cool, but here in the streamlined book of Mark, we don't get to see that quite so much. Let us continue on. The Gospel according to Mark 15:32. Let the Christ, the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see it, and trust in and rely on him, and adhere to him. Those who were crucified with him also reviled and reproached him, speaking abusively, harshly, and insolently. So what they are saying here in essence is that they'll believe on Christ, they'll follow him, but only if he does what they desire. They want to see this sign, they want to see this miracle of him delivering himself from the crucifixion, not understanding its purpose or why he is even there. But they figure, well, God should be doing this. But God doesn't follow the plans of men. He follows his own plan. So in that way, they don't trust in Jesus. Instead, they are using this as a reason to mock him. And I think the reason why the gospel goes over this in so much detail is that we get to see Jesus being mocked by a variety of different people from different statuses along the way. From the lowly criminal, the Roman prison guards, to the priest and even the high priest. From the highest position to the lowest position, all are mocking Jesus. And that is the same as what we see today, from religious leaders to the common person to corporate overlords, celebrities, comedians, workers of various industries. It is a commonality finding mockery with Jesus without having understanding or faith or belief or trust in him. And that is truly unfortunate, but as it was back then, so it is today. The Gospel according to Mark 15:33. And when the 6th hour, about midday, had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, about 3 o'clock. So Jesus has been on the cross for some time now, and we're in the midday. And there's an event that occurs. There's a darkness that comes out. Perhaps this is an eclipse or some type of solar event. But seeing the events that have transpired before, and seeing who this man claims to be, this is a very unique situation or scenario, or at least one that would probably make the hair stand on end of everybody that was watching. A very auspicious scenario. If this was an eclipse, it's a very long time for one to be active. Usually they're around 10 minutes or less. And here we have it going for multiple hours of the day. So this is certainly a strange occurrence, and certainly some type of sign. The Gospel according to Mark 15:34. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me, deserting me and leaving me helpless and abandoned? So it is quite dark out, not because of the time of day, but because of this event. And Jesus is about to breathe his last breath. But before he does that, we see his final words here. And they are very similar to lines that we read in the Psalms. Psalms 22:1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? I've heard people make the case or the argument before that during this time, the bond between the Father and the Son were separated so that God could fully judge the Son and pour out his wrath upon him. This was not simply Jesus dying from the crucifixion. This was something more. Something far more terrifying. And those that hold this view use this verse as an example that his agony here is not from the crucifixion, but from the separation from the Father. Of course, there's others that do not hold this view, that it is simply Jesus suffering and dying on the cross, and God is a one unit despite being three beings. In any case, we see Jesus' last words here. In the other Gospels, we find out that these are not his last words, but they are the last words we see here in the book of Mark. Let us continue on. The Gospel according to Mark 15:35. And some of those standing by and hearing it said, See, he is calling Elijah. 15:36. And one man ran and filled a sponge with vinegar, a mixture of sour wine and water, put it on a staff made of a bamboo-like reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Hold off, let us see whether Elijah does come to take him down. So the atmosphere has changed dramatically, and I'm sure it changed dramatically the second there was the darkening of the sky. But now, after all this, and when Jesus cried out, the people were in amazement. They were thinking perhaps he was telling the truth, that he is calling Elijah. We see this man here running to get this sponge with vinegar. He's giving that to Jesus to try to preserve him, to try to get him to live longer, to see if this thing's going to be fulfilled, to see whether or not Elijah comes. And what's funny about it is that this is in reference, or in the book of Psalms, there's like a prophecy of this event in Psalms 69:21, which reads, They also gave me gall for my food, and my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. It's quite impressive, the amount of prophecies and how many Psalms we see a reference what Jesus is going through here. And it makes you think, when David was writing these Psalms, what was going on in his life when he drew a comparison to write some of these things down? I mean, we know that they were inspired by the Holy Spirit and he led him to write these things down, but there had to be a scenario or a situation that led him to do this. And this is hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus was on the cross. And crucifixion didn't even exist. Certainly these Psalms and the Old Testament came from outside our perception of time. That's the only way it could predict these things. The Gospel according to Mark 15:37. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed out his life. So we don't see Jesus' final line that he speaks here in this gospel. It's found in the other gospels when he submits his life to the Lord and allows himself to pass away and die. But for whatever reason, it wasn't recorded here in the Gospel of Mark. Perhaps Mark, the person, didn't get to hear Jesus' final line. It's hard to say, but this is the way that it's written. Let's continue on. The Gospel according to Mark 15:38. And the curtain of the Holy of Holies of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So the Holy of Holies was the portion that separated the main chamber of the temple from the back portion, the Holy of Holies. That's where the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat were stored. So this was a cutting of the barrier, or a tearing of the barrier between God and man, symbolizing that the relationship was repaired by cutting down that obstacle in between the two. Let's continue on. The Gospel according to Mark 15:39. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw him expire this way, he said, Really? This man was God's son? Isn't it quite interesting that Jesus' disciples didn't really trust him, or didn't really believe in him, didn't really listen to what he was saying when he said that he would die? But here we see the first one to say anything is this centurion, this Gentile. He's not Jewish. He's not part of Jesus' disciples. He is an outsider, but he is the first to recognize and to state openly that he is the Son of God. This centurion, he doesn't know that much of Jesus. He only saw his conduct and his actions of his life approaching the end. He saw the people mocking at him. He probably mocked him himself, and saw the whole crowd against him. And as he hung there on the cross, the different groups of people that would come by, and how Jesus never said anything to counter them. And then seeing this crazy event where the sky got dark and then seeing him cry out at the end. This was enough for this man to believe that he was the Son of God. His conduct was so different than what would normally be presented. Normally somebody defends themselves when they are being accused, but Jesus didn't. Normally somebody responds when they are being abused, but Jesus didn't. So through these accusations and abuses, he did not respond. This centurion has probably either crucified or been witness to many crucifixions, so he knew the standards for how things would go, and he could see that this was different. He wasn't set up and limited by preconceived notions. He was not taught in the way of the Torah. So due to his freedom, he was able to see clearly that which these other witnesses did not see. We had the religious leaders, and there was probably lots of very educated people there witnessing this, and they did not draw the same conclusion that he did. The Gospel according to Mark 15:40. Now some women were there also, looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. 15:41. Who, when Jesus was in Galilee, were in the habit of accompanying and ministering to him. And there were also many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. 15:42. As evening had already come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as Jesus hung on the tree, there were many witnesses, and here we have some women being pointed out as being witnesses. This is going to show up as an important point later on. And there's certain laws and certain rules for when they execute somebody and they are hanging, that they are required to take them down before nightfall. Deuteronomy 21, 22, 23. If a man has committed a sin deserving of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. He who is hanged is accursed to God. So the ironic part about this is that in the Torah, the Old Testament, the death penalty was to be enacted with stoning, and they would get together, everybody in the village, they'd come down to a certain location, they'd throw stones at somebody till they were dead. So they didn't have hanging as a form of execution. But here we see provision for what to do in the event that somebody is hanging from the tree, that they're not to just leave them up there. Lots of places around the world, that's what they would do. They would hang somebody and they would just leave them up there until they were like a skeleton, or they'd be falling apart. And that would be kind of a warning to other people. But God did not like that, so he required them to take down the bodies. And that's what we're seeing here. We also see this leading into the Sabbath day, which is the holy day that they're not supposed to be working on, so that complicates things further as well. So there's kind of a deadline in dealing with the body of Jesus. Let's continue on. The Gospel according to Mark 15:43. Joseph, he of Arimathea, noble and honorable in rank, and a respected member of the council, Sanhedrin, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, daring the consequences, took courage and ventured to go to Pilate and ask for the body of Jesus. So here we have this well-respected man who was a member of the Sanhedrin. Now the Sanhedrin, that was the group we saw earlier, that when the high priest brought Jesus in and they were questioning him, the Sanhedrin were part of that event. They were part of that council. So this man here, he went to Pilate, the leader of the Romans, and asked for the body of Jesus. So maybe this man was thinking along the same lines as that centurion. Or perhaps he saw the nobility in the way that Jesus conducted himself. Whatever the situation may have been, he had a desire to bury the body of Jesus and to claim the body of Jesus so that, they wasn't just thrown to the wolves and maybe they defiled it, or whatever the case may have been, that he went to claim the body of Jesus. The Gospel according to Mark 15:44. But Pilate wondered whether he was dead so soon, and having called the centurion, he asked him whether Jesus was already dead. 15:45. And when he learned from the centurion that he was indeed dead, he gave the body to Joseph. So this is another section that we see a lot more in the other Gospels. The details of verification of the death of Jesus. And when we get to those books, we'll check those out. But this Gospel is streamlining this, so we're going to do the same. So Jesus wasn't crucified for very long. Perhaps it took a lot longer normally for someone to die from crucifixion, or they would expedite the process. But here we go. Jesus is already dead. The centurion verified it. And we see that Pilate did this. After verifying the death of Jesus, he gave him over to this man to look after the body. The Gospel according to Mark 15:46. And Joseph bought a fine linen cloth for swathing dead bodies, and taking him down from the cross, he rolled him up in the fine linen cloth, and placed him in a tomb which had been hewn out of a rock. Then he rolled a very large stone against the door of the tomb. So this man looked after the body of Jesus very well, and he spared no expense. He didn't cheapen out on this, and he had him buried, or he buried him in this tomb that was hewn out of the rock. And I got another line from Isaiah, because there's so many prophecies relating to this event. Isaiah 53:9. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. A pretty incredible verse. Let's continue going. The Gospel according to Mark 15:47. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, were attentively observing where he was laid. So the women that we saw earlier, they were watching and they saw the location that Jesus was buried in. This is going to be important in the next chapter, for we're going to see something that is incredible, something that changes everything that we're talking about even to this day.